Now, what I do have significant problems with, especially in Splatoon 3, more so than in Splatoon 2, didn't play Splatoon 1 so I can't comment there, is choke points. A choke point is a position on the map where everything is funneled into a relatively small area. One of the worst offenders of this of all time was the choke area, marked choke, on Kelp Dome in Splatoon 2. There were a lot of objectives on this map where, in order to score, you needed to push through this tiny little narrow passageway. This wall here was not paintable at all. There were a couple of ways around it, but they all kind of sucked. One of them was to go up over this great bridge. Great bridges are terrible for traversal. They deny you the movement that makes Splatoon fast and fun, and they should only be used in cases where you need to make a route particularly bad to traverse. And I would argue just try to avoid using them at all, because they're kind of lame for most weapons. Now, there are some weapons that can take a special advantage of these. Something like a Hydra Splatling, for example, that's going to run a lot of run speed anyway, was actually a monster on Kelp Dome, because you could put it up on these grates and hit anything that could come from any direction at you, 360 degrees. You could see it all because you could shoot through these things. And you were faster moving across them than any other weapon because the run speed you already had to run. So they were especially happy with those kinds of formations in that game. But for most weapons, especially any weapon that's trying to actually get up here, something that's trying to frontline and get over here, walking across these great bridges was just terrifying and never felt good because you had to go so slowly to get there. It was just really easy to wall off. So this was never great, and then the only other option was to go across another great bridge on the other side of the map and try and come down behind the entire enemy team to get there. And this flank was okay, but it isolated you really hard from the rest of the team, so it had to be coordinated very carefully and played very skillfully. So most of the time, the vast majority of your team in any given mode that had to push through here would cluster one side around here, one side around here, and all you could do to get through this choke point was launch specials at each other. If you tried to run through, any one of the three weapons that were looking at you could very easily just paint or shoot at you directly, pre-fire you, and make it impossible to cross without really even seeing you that well. It was not a very difficult thing to defend at all. And so you needed overwhelming force. Well, that meant that before we can cross this, we're launching missiles and throwing a booyah bomb. We're doing something like launching a stingray and then pushing someone through as the missiles are falling. It's multiple specials that we're launching at them, which gets so crazy to the point that it's basically making the game unplayable for the enemy team. That's the only way that you can get through here. It's too easily defended. That degenerates gameplay to the point where it's not really fun to play at a competitive level. It's just like, okay, we'll sit here on opposite sides of the choke point and launch specials at each other until someone screws up and dies. We don't want the game to degenerate down to missile dodging simulator or stingray dodging simulator. We don't want booyah bombs to be the only way to be able to move forward. We want to be able to use tactics. We want to be able to create flanks, to create distractions, to have multiple angles of approach. Choke points are completely antithetical to that much more interesting and much more expressive style of play. And they make it a lot more frustrating to play the game that way. And so, for that reason, I would consider choke points to be a very negative aspect of a map if they are too central a part of it. Now, that's not to say that choke points in general are bad. In fact, they're kind of unavoidable and can be handled well. On the Reef, there was a famous choke point that is the bridge. This bridge is very important. It was a major high ground location, and it gave you access in zones, for example, to both sides of the zone, or to the people that are trying to guard it, more importantly. It was a really crucial passageway to move to the opponent's side of the map, and to be able to do so from high ground. So it was a choke point. There were a lot of times where, in the game's meta, where you just launch a tent shield across the way, or use splash walls with the 52 gal to cross over. You needed some kind of overwhelming force, and typically you would pop a special before you'd try to go over the top. But the advantage of the Reef is that the choke point wasn't the only way to get through the map. You could choose to run a tent umbrella or a splash wall comp or something and bully your way through that choke point, or you could send somebody around the right flank or the left flank, or on some maps, the far left flank. There were so many ways to get around this choke point that while on this part of the map it definitely mattered, it wasn't the only way across, and so gameplay didn't degenerate to just who could not die to specials the fastest. You had ways around. You could go under the bridge and come up here, which was its own choke point, and so you got the situation where you had to choose which choke point you wanted to push through or which choke point you wanted to force the opponents to rotate to. There were a lot more options than just that one choke point. That choke point didn't just dominate the game. It wasn't such a simple metagame that it boiled down to who can throw specials at this one spot on the map the best. So, how does Splatoon 3 do on that? Pretty abysmally. It is probably the worst set of stages in the series for choke points. Scorch Gorge is probably my least favorite map in all of Splatoon 3. I will acknowledge that there's a mode or two that's a little bit more playable, but the overall design philosophy on this map, they were so close to having a map that I liked, and then there were just some very weird mistakes that they made that made this map way less playable at a competitive level. I was looking at this map when they were showing off the trailers and thinking, oh, this is going to be a good one. And then I went into Scorch Gorge Turf War in, I think, the opening Splatfest premiere, and I was like, wait, why is there only one way across mid? And why is that one route across mid a great bridge? Who decided that that was a good idea? In Splat Zones, this is just a bowl. There is no way up the other side. The only way that you ever get to move anywhere besides the area where the zone is if you wipe the enemy team and already have a frontliner close enough to mid that they can get across this bridge without getting absolutely destroyed by all the high ground around it. This bridge is the worst choke point in all of Splatoon. I can't think of one that's at all worse. There's just no cover. There's no fast movement. You can't, throw a special and then get across it quickly. It's either you wipe the entire enemy team or you are stuck in mid. And it's disgusting. Splat Zones is supposed to work where you take the zone and then you try to control the area in front of the zone. But you can't get in front of the zone. It's so impossible to get someone across this bridge. If you do manage to get people across the bridge, now you can completely lock people out and make it very, very difficult with the high ground you have in their spawn. We'll talk about that a little bit later to be able to kind of set up a sort of spawn camp situation. But man, getting out of mid is so bad. It feels terrible. And there's no real good reason for it. This brings me to another point that I just can't understand about some of the Splatoon 3 maps, which is their navigability. How easily can you move through the map? Scorch Gorge would have been so much of a better map if they just made a few more walls paintable. I think it would be a better map if they just made every single wall paintable. I can understand why they might not want to do that and why that might not be the best idea, but it would still improve it drastically from where it is. What if you could actually get into the enemy side by climbing these walls here, or these walls here? That would change the map pretty drastically. It would make it a lot more navigable. It would make it so that you can actually move around the map And you can use the movement techniques that make Splatoon cool. Splatoon is cool in part because of your ability to move. And if you're not able to move in the way that the game is designed to allow you to move, it's like, why do I even have this option? Why am I allowed to swim up walls in this video game if you're not going to give me any walls I can swim up? I think that that verticality and that ability to traverse is part of what makes this game cool, and taking that away just because, well, the map wouldn't work that way. Okay, make a different map then. Make one where it does work. Make one that shows that part of the game off. Make one that lets me move around with my squid in a cool way. Another thing that I like to see is the ability to use the unique movement mechanics like squid rolling. Squid surging, I think that's a problematic mechanic because they made it slower than just mashing the B button to swim up the wall. So I think that that's going to have limited utility wherever you put it. But squid rolling, I think, is a really cool little movement mechanic for getting up and over ledges that are a little bit small. And there are a lot of those little ledges in Splatoon 3 and a lot of cool little ways that you can swim and jump off a block. I've made a couple of videos about ways to use those squid rolls. And there are generally some pretty good ways to use that on a lot of the maps. Very few that don't really use them super well. That's something that I do look for a little bit. To summarize these couple of points, I want to talk about the overall shape that a stage should generally be. To compare, I want to show off the Reef, which I think is the gold standard of Splatoon map design. Of the maps I've seen, Splatoon 1, again, is a blind spot for me, so I don't have strong opinions about those maps. The ones that haven't been ported over and the ones that have been ported over are different. So for me, the Reef is about as good as it ever got. The Reef is a square, effectively. You have very, very wide spawn points. So you're able to get out onto the map on the far left side or on the far right side from area that is basically uncontestable spawn point area. There are some creative ways to get up about to here on most modes, maybe a little bit further. But the majority of the time in, a fairly even game, nobody's ever going to push that far up. And so you're going to get full access to rolling out all the way here on the left-hand side, all the way out here on the right-hand side. That's almost a full 180 degrees around the map that you're able to leave spawn from. And again, basically without being contestable at all, unless maybe there's a charger sitting down here or something like that that's looking at one of those angles. It's a very, very forgiving map. It's very spawn camp proof. On top of that, there aren't any major choke points that can't be circumnavigated. One of the beautiful things about Reef that I cannot believe is so rare to find in a Splatoon map is that you don't have to go through mid. You can go all the way around to the right-hand side and get through here. You can go all the way around the left-hand side and get through here. You can send every single member of your team in a direction that doesn't actually force them to play the middle of the map. Now, the middle of the map is going to be advantageous because there's this really good high ground position that's going to be kind of sniping at you as you try and run around on one of those sides. But it gives weapons flank routes. And flank routes are something that Splatoon 3 maps are very sorely lacking in a lot of places. In Mahi Mahi, part of the problem is just that the map is too small. But there are only two routes. There is left and there is right. And they both converge in exactly the same place. It is impossible to play the objective without going through mid. There's no way around mid. It's the only thing that's there. It's literally half the map. And that holds true for a lot of different maps in the game. One of the other nasty examples of this was Walleye Warehouse in Splatoon 2. In Walleye, you've got these little side routes on the left and the right here. So it's still better than Mahi in that regard, which is crazy to say, but these all sucked. Because all you needed was one long-range weapon right here, watching this angle, and now you can't flank, and you still have to go through mid. And this area, alley here, against a coordinated competitive team, this was going to get shut down pretty much every time you tried to push out there, unless the rest of the team was pushing in with you at the same time. So again, the overwhelming force problem, the choke point problem. So again, this map had major problems. And one thing that I'll point out about these is that these are not squares, these are rectangles. So all of the advantages that I just said about Reef, let's look at Walleye for comparison. Very, very, very narrow spawn point. What are your options from spawn? Dropping on the left side here or dropping on the right side here. You're like an Aerospray's range away with those two options. There's just going to be a T-Tech sharking here ready to pop an inkjet as soon as they charge it to literally sit right here and hold you in spawn, and there's nowhere else you can go. So there are very few maps, I would say, where spawn camping is an actually legitimate complaint. Walleye Warehouse was actually one of them, and that was one of the reasons that this is one of the worst stages in all of Splatoon. But here's another example from one of my favorite maps from Splatoon 2, Piranha Pit. On this map, you can roll out to the right side over here and spawn out from this way, and you're actually on the other side of mid. Like, this area right here puts you closer to the enemy goal in Clamblitz than it puts you to your own goal in Clamblitz. And that was a really neat aspect of this map, that it was relatively round. So relatively, I wouldn't say square exactly, I don't know. Squares, circles, like, they're both fine, I think. Humpback Pump Track was another example of a round map. There's a lot of width to it, is the important part here. If it's too narrow, then it's too choke pointy. There are fewer options, and weapons that are trying to flank are going to get shut down because they don't have very many options. But if Clam Basket is right here and you're trying to push it, you have the option to go this way, you have the option to go this way, you have the option to go this way. And yes, those all take you at least pretty close to mid, but you can at least move around mid instead of going directly through it, directly through this crazy no man's land. And in fact, that's the way that you typically had to do it because this area was just too dangerous. But Mahi Mahi is nothing but that middle of the map. It is nothing but open ground with almost no cover. It's just a no man's land. It's trench warfare. You're just launching bigger and bigger things at each other and hunching down. Man, this is becoming a depressing comparison to World War I that I don't want to go too much further with. But suffice it to say, this does not feel good for the typical foot soldier. You want to feel like you have the agency to be able to make an individual play rather than having to rely on heavy artillery to be able to get anywhere, or to feel like you need to just charge down a fairly unsafe area and be shot at the whole way that you're going and just like hope that they miss or hope that you distract them enough that somebody else can get around on the other side. Man, why is this so comparable to real life wars? We're going to move on. So, squares, good. Circles, good. Rectangles, bad. Another shape that I want to talk about that we don't like is hourglasses. Now, this doesn't look like an hourglass until you think about where it is on this map that you can actually stand. So, this whole area right here, very nice and wide, lots of different options, lots of high ground for the defenders to use, a good amount of cover for the attackers to use, very well balanced. But then you get to mid, and it suddenly becomes from here to here. It gets way, way narrower. And Wahoo was generally not well regarded as a map in Splatoon 2 because of how difficult it was to traverse mid. The options that you had to go through mid, not only did you have fewer of them than on most maps, like the Reef, for example, but they were relatively small, they were generally choke points, and they tended to put you at some kind of disadvantage when you were trying to push through them. So if you're trying to push through and these bridges are not up, because the bridges were hands down the best way to actually get into mid, but if these bridges were not up, then you had to either walk across unpaintable turf, you had to go from low ground up a wall up onto the enemy side, or you had to drop down in full view of the enemy plat, go through a low ground trench, and flank through some area where you didn't have any cover to try and maybe catch a backliner who wasn't looking at you. And those were the only ways that you could actually get through mid. All of them put you at a significant positional disadvantage, and so nobody ever wanted to get through mid. Tower control Wahoo on Splatoon 2 was such a stalemate. You almost never saw solo queue games that were able to actually push through the first checkpoint, because without set plays of designed combinations of specials, it was just too difficult a lot of the time to get that tower to descend into the low ground area with no cover and actually survive there on the tower long enough to be able to hold it with your back to a wall and no escape route. So hourglass maps we don't like either, because being able to traverse mid is a really important aspect of having fun playing the game and not just being, in trench warfare where all you can do is wait for a bigger booyah bomb to get thrown at the other team.